Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our presentation on labor supply. This is me, Anna, Leah, and Caroline.
All right, so the first article was about unintended consequences of immigration enforcement, and it was by Easton Velasquez. So the research question of the study was, does secure communities rollout affect the labor supply of US-born workers who are likely to outsource household production? Some background on this is that secure communities is a federal immigration policy which increases information shared between local law enforcement and ICE, and basically results in more detention and deportation of immigrants. Household production in the study is things like childcare, cooking and cleaning, things that can be outsourced to other laborers. And the focus population of the study was US-born, college-educated women with preschool children who are under age 5. So basically what happened is that the rollout of the policy affected the immigrant labor supply with this thing called the chilling effect, which meant that fewer immigrant workers were willing to go to work at all, and the workers who were willing to go to work reduced their hours dramatically, which increased the price of outsourcing that labor for the Native women, and therefore increased the opportunity cost of them working. So the findings were that the rollout increased the cost of immigrant household labor and decreased the supply of Native labor, which is the substitution effect to a T. The opportunity cost of working went up, which caused them to work less.
The next article we looked at kind of looks at the income effect and how work allocations of Swedish lottery winners changes before and after they win the lottery. So the research question in this study was whether an exogenous wealth shock leads to changes in how people are earning money, and that largely attributed to reductions in working hours. So the researchers in this study looked at how people who had won the lottery in Sweden changed the amount of earnings they had before and after they won the lottery. And the strength of this data set is that it can really isolate and find the magnitude of the income effect because of how specific a lottery win is to just like unearned income. So findings of the study show that after winning the lottery, people's earnings in the short term and long run changed, and this was largely attributed to them working less time, so increasing their leisure. And this impact was seen across both individuals and households, and was true across all demographics that they looked at. So this study really shows that when you increase somebody's wealth without increasing their opportunity costs, they are going to consume more and take more leisure time, which, as we can see in this diagram, that's like straight up from our textbook. This represents the income effect in a completely isolated setting.
Yeah, so the next article looks at the condition of poverty to reveal an important limitation on this model. And the research question is about the income effect here, as you can see. And they're looking at a program called GUP, which stands for Graduating the Ultra Poor, which has 6 components, including skills training, health services, access to a saving account. But this study only looks at one component, which is the cash transfer aspect. And it controls for the other ones by running conditions that isolate those. But that's not really important to the central part of this. It's basically looking at the impact of participation in that program on labor supply through a bag making operation, which is exactly what it sounds like. And it looks at several statistics, most importantly, the number of bags, the quality of bags, and the earnings over time, and how long it takes them to make those. And they found that GUP participants chose to work more, which means they took less free time and they worked more efficiently. And they also found that that impact was due to the psychological productivity effect, which is the idea that improving their overall well-being will have a positive impact on their psychology that will translate into greater labor supply. And they knew this because they found that it was not due to investment productivity effect, which is the idea of people investing capital in their own labor, because they controlled for that by providing the inputs, and they found that it was not due to a physiological productivity effect because it didn't have an impact on health or consumption. And so I drew a little model here, and basically all this is showing is that the prediction is that the income effect would be positive, but in reality, the income effect is 0 or slightly negative because that psychological productivity effect makes people want to work more even though they don't have to, so supply goes up. So the main takeaway is that this psychological productivity effect takes into account factors that the model leaves out, and it falls short by not accounting for mental health, bandwidth, access to information, family structure, things like that. And those things make it impossible for people to act completely rationally, and that effect is amplified when they're living in poverty.
Okay, so my article was about strengthening women's financial control and how that impacts labor supply and gender norms. So like I just said, their research question is, can increasing control over earnings incentivize a woman to work and thereby influence norms around gender roles? So in rural India, they basically gave women their own bank accounts rather than having to go through their husbands to deposit their own earnings, and saw how that would affect not only gender norms, but also like whether they would work more if they had control over their own money. They found that initially the gender norms were so constrictive that it actually took about 3 years to see any real change in the labor supply due to more control over your finances. But in the short term, there can still be some indirect changes in gender norms by increasing women's financial control, and then specific increases in bargaining power. So having your own bank account in addition to a direct deposit option and training on how to use your account can also increase your participation in the labor supply. So this graph shows basically what I was just saying. And you can see in the first column that the only real increase in the labor supply was when the accounts were coupled with the direct deposit and the training, whereas everything else was didn't show an increase in the labor supply because we're not increasing these women's incomes. Account use increased for everyone except for the women who were in controls who didn't have their own bank accounts, and then empowerment was pretty much constant. And then we saw slight changes in gender norms, but I think that was more of a long-term difference. And so this showed deviation from the constrained choice model due to gender norms' impact on women's participation in the workforce. And this article showed that even though women can be part of the workforce and have their own control over their income by having their own bank accounts, if their husbands have a lot stricter gender norms or they have their own internalized gender norms, they're a lot less likely to participate in the workforce and work longer hours due to, maybe they think that they should be home with their children, or their husbands should be the primary breadwinners. Yeah, and I'm just reiterating, gender norms can lessen the income effect or even render it useless if husbands believe their wives should work in the home. And so this shows a limitation in the hypothesis of this study, because they hypothesized that increasing women's bargaining power would also increase their participation in the labor market, but that didn't actually happen because of how strict the gender norms are where the study was conducted.
Right. So for my study and for Chinmay's study, the policy implications are a lot more obvious because it follows they both follow the constrained choice model to a T. And so the effects that economists would predict and expect could be countered or hindered or helped by policies that address this directly in a way that economists would expect them to.
Yeah, and the model is definitely less applicable in our cases because they are counterexamples to when the model doesn't exactly prove right, but there are still important policy implications that come out of these things. For example, in the poverty case, it showed that there was a negative income effect, but that things like providing supplemental income like that can actually encourage people to work more if you improve their psychological well-being, which is an important policy implication because governments can take that and consider programs similar to GOP.
As far as, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, in all of these studies, it's pretty clear that whether you follow the income or substitution effect perfectly or whether you don't, like, life doesn't. And I think there's a lot of merit in doing more studies, not only on, deviations from the constrained choice model, but also intersectionality. And we talked a little bit about gender norms and the pay gap and poverty and psychology. And I think studies done with different gender presentations and different ethnicities and races would show a lot more deviations from the norm, just because a lot of the models we see are with homogenous groups of people, and more research could, disprove a lot of that.
Yeah, and to add on to what Anna was saying. Even the more straightforward articles that we looked at, like mine and Leah's, they are very specific to a very specific case. And we don't really know what other psychological underpinnings there are to these cases. So while they do represent one sense in which a certain model looks like what we studied in class, further research is definitely needed in a more diversified, set of areas to really get to the bottom of what's happening. So that's our presentation. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And we are happy that we solved everything about the labor and income effect, or labor substitution and income effects today for you guys. And we'll see you guys in class.